Welcome to the Casual Author Podcast. I'm Dan, sci-fi and fantasy author. Like you, I've got a lot on my plate. What with many children, a full-time job, a homestead, and loads of other responsibilities. I'm here to bring you inspiration, positivity, and community around having a busy life and still wanting to chase that author dream, even if you have to take a casual approach. For more information about the podcast, me, or my books, head to thecasualauthor.com. Let's get started. Hey there, it's Dan Kenner with episode number 140 of The Casual Author. Today we're talking to Elizabeth Drysdale about adjusting your author strategy to achieve success. We talk about how she first started with her publishing journey, how she started querying different agents and different publishers in the way that didn't match her voice, and how she had to adjust that, shift that so she could find the right publisher, and how she knew she found the right publisher. Talk a little bit about rights and purchasing rights so that she can do some things for herself, but also how she's working with the publisher and how she's been able to achieve success even after writing for years and years and years. So she had a number of books built up before she was able to find the right publisher, and now she's getting those out pretty regularly. So you want to stick around for that conversation. We talk a lot about hard truths and about learning about the querying process, which is something I'm not super familiar with, but definitely learned a lot from her, and just how mindset and strategy shifts, even slightly, can make a huge difference when you're trying to achieve success as an author. So stick around for that. I think you're really going to enjoy that. So first thing you may notice is that this episode came out on a Monday. So surprise, I decided to shift the schedule from Wednesdays to Mondays. And there's a number of reasons for that. Historically, I try to record the intro to each podcast sometime during the course of Monday, during the day or in the evening or in the morning or something, whatever makes most sense. Ironically, my family is set in a very specific schedule when I go to work. Outside of that, Saturdays, any day I have off are a little bit wild. And it's amazing how many holidays land on Mondays during the year. It's not a bad thing. It just those Mondays are chaotic, right? I'm working out in the homestead, I'm building houses, I'm doing all sorts of crazy things. Things happen with the kids. It's just I'm not able to stay consistent with getting the intro created for the podcast in time to edit it for Wednesday for it to come out. So I decided it's going to make more sense logistically and consistency wise to shift the pushing of each podcast out to Mondays. So you'll see that today and moving forward. The new episodes will come out on Mondays in the morning, probably sometime around 2 a.m. Mountain Time, something kind of arbitrary, just because I set it and leave it, the day or two before. So that's what you can now expect from the Casual Author. Is now going to be a Monday release podcast. Hopefully that doesn't rain on your parade too much, but I figure it's not too different. Additionally, if you're listening to this and you follow my author journey on TikTok, Instagram, whatever, or if you're subscribed to my email list, first of all, thank you for that. I appreciate it. You can get a free book. It's the prequel to the Lightbearer Chronicles. It's called Shielded. It's kind of about the mother of one of the main characters in the trilogy. So definitely want to grab that. But I want to point out that I'm actually going to be separating my email lists. So I've just found that the audience for the Casual Author sometimes aligns with the audience for my fantasy and sci-fi business, but they don't align perfectly. I've just noticed there hasn't been a lot of interaction with my email list and the podcast. And that's not a problem. I think those people are there for my creativity. They're there for my stories to interact with my fantasy and my sci-fi stories, some homestead stuff, but not necessarily the podcast. So I will be starting then a newsletter for this podcast. If you want to get updates about the podcast episodes, I'll probably email bi-weekly, possibly monthly. Bi-weekly seems to make more sense, but I'm also going to pack into that some of my learnings. I'm a big long form content consumer, meaning I love podcasts. I love help videos. I love anything that's very long form, long explanations or discussions. So I'm going to start including in the intro to this podcast, as well as in that email list, things that I'm learning, skills that I'm learning in different podcasts that I've listened to that I gained a lot from. So it's going to be more than just, hey, here are the episodes. This is what I talked about. It's also going to be things that I've learned and experiences and skills I've gained over that period of time, and just kind of pass that back to you. See if there's something in there that might be a gem for you to learn from as well. We'll see how it goes. I don't love writing emails, but I've been pretty good at staying consistent. So I'll pat myself on the back for that. But okay, so into the updates. It hasn't been as busy the past 2 weeks as it was
for the period before then. I did take some time off though this last week. I was actually on PTO from my full-time job for the whole week. I do that every October though. End of October, we have two birthdays. So my son and my daughter, so my second son and the fourth child is a daughter as well. They have birthdays at the end of October. And I try to take birthdays off for my kids so that we can go do something fun during the day. We work together. We, just have a chill day to play games, hang out. And it just makes sense that it aligns. They're within a few days of each other, and it aligns with, the cold coming very soon. So I usually take the last week of October off. And that was this last week. Now, most of it was cleanup, picking up tools, pulling down fences, pulling down electric fences. This year, however, it was also building a structure for the cow. So she has been without shelter since we got her a few months ago. And cows are pretty chill. They don't care. She'll sit out in the rain. She probably would even sit out in the snow. But I think there's also we need a place for her to get out of the wind. The wind is really brutal here in Idaho Falls, and she needs a place to get away from it. She tried to kind of nestle herself between the feeder and the goat house, which is just a pallet structure. I mean, that thing I have to duck down pretty low to get in the goat house. And she was chill. She was pretty okay with it. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like we're good stewards for her as her owners. So I decided to build a structure. And the materials I talked about buying those all last week. It was chaotic to get them all. It was expensive and very heavy. I had to get a trailer from my neighbor to get it all. But the structure is mostly done. That's what I've been working on this week. It is a lean-to, so pretty much we are leveraging the wall, the north, actually rather the west. I know my directions, I promise. The east wall of the shop. And so the back wall is that. And I just built some sidewalls and a roof and everything. It's been an enlightening project. It is the biggest structure I've ever built before so far, but I think it turned out really, really well. I did it primarily myself, only because my wife has been very busy with the baby. She nurses him, 4 or 5 times more a day, so she's not always available. But I managed to make it work, and it's pretty square and it's pretty sturdy, and she loves it. She loves going in there and sleeping, and now she has a place to get out of the wind and the rain. So pretty happy about that. It was a lot of work, but I'm pretty proud of what I did, so can't complain about it. Now, some interesting things because the cold has hit. I know I talked about preparation for the cold. It did hit this week, ironically. So at night, we're getting into the low 20s. It's freezing. We've already had some snow. It hasn't stuck, but it has started snowing. One thing that was a little bit of a surprise to us was her milk. Her name is Ginger, if I haven't mentioned that before. Ginger's milk dropped drastically, which we were not prepared for. We were getting anywhere from 5 to 6 gallons a day, and now it's about 3 gallons a day. So that's not necessarily a problem. You may think 3 gallons a day is still a lot, and it is. But we are hoping to put away a lot more cheese. My wife made quite a number of blocks of cheese, hard cheeses, cheddar, Butter, queso, Parmesan, all these different hard cheeses. And we were hoping to get about double what we got. So seeing her milk drop is pretty alarming, and it keeps dropping fast every day. Fortunately, we have some friends in the cow business, so we talk to them and they say, oh, their milk always drops with the cold. That's not something you should be concerned about. However, one thing you can do is just not overfeed them because they'll only eat as much as they need, but just give them extra food so that they can kind of eat as much as they want. Overeat, so to speak, and then that will get into their milk production. And I wasn't. I was giving her the same amount of hay that I was when it was warm. And I was noticing she was eating it. She wasn't eating it all gone, but her milk dropped. And so they said, well, in the winter, what they do is cows will forage through the hay and they'll find what's best for them and they'll only eat that and they'll kind of leave the rest of it until they're forced to eat it. So they just expect that there's going to be a lot of waste in the winter. I know it sounds terrible, but if you give them more of what they need, then their milk will increase. And this person we talked to said it's a difference of she gets 3 gallons a day from her cow or 7 gallons if she gives her that, way more hay. So we are opting for the more hay. I'm going to give them a whole bale, whole 90-pound bale every day and see if she eats it. But hopefully that'll bring the milk back up. We would love to keep making cheeses if we can, but we'll see. I mean, we'll take what we can get. We're grateful for her. We also stopped milking Adele, who is our goat. It's coming pretty close to her needing to be bred again, and it's good to give them a break. She was only giving us about a quart a day. We love the goat's milk. It's fantastic, but we figured we'd give her a break. My 7-year-old son has been milking her, and he's been doing a phenomenal job. He'll go get her, and he'll put her on the stand, tie her legs up, clean her off, and milk her. So I think he's a little bummed that he's going to be done, but he's also not bummed because it's pretty cold. So it's not always ideal to be milking an animal in very, very cold weather. But yeah, I believe that's everything. Instead of cleaning up, I mean, putting tools away, it's not the most exciting work in the world, but it's busy. Been very, very busy. I think it's funny when I tell people I take PTO at work, they always say, "Oh, cool, you're taking a whole week off," which is very unusual, by the way. What are you doing? Are you going on vacation? I say, "Oh, no, I'm working." I take PTO from my full-time job so that I can work at my part-time job, which is homesteading. It's really not a job though, because we don't get any profit from it. So it's just a little bit funny. I take PTO to work. It's just the reality of being a homestead owner. But we got a lot done, so I'm pretty happy with the week, which is great. All right. So in terms of author news, I already mentioned the podcast shifting to Mondays. I already mentioned the email list for the podcast. By the way, it's probably not going to be up by the time this podcast goes out, but you can still check. Maybe I'll by some miracle between now and Monday, I'll be able to do it. Uh, it will be at thecasualauthor.com. There'll be a sign up form there. Currently, there's not going to be anything you get for it. It's just an opt in where you'll get this updates. Feel free to do so, no pressure, obviously. But I'm hoping to put together kind of a freebie. I have some ideas for like a nonfiction. It's not really a book. It's like a framework that I follow. I get so many people that ask me, how do you get so much done, right? You're a father of seven. I'm a churchgoer. I'm a religious. I have religious responsibilities, a full-time job. I have a homestead with a bunch of animals, and I'm authoring. And they say, how do you get so much done? And part of it's sleep. I should get more sleep. But there are a number of things that I do. And so almost the secret, so to speak, of how I manage my life, how I manage to get so much done. And it's just going to be kind of a summary of that, or some suggestions for you if you're in the same boat as me. It's definitely made a huge difference, and it's allowed me to, with everything going on since 2020, I've published 9 books. So I don't think that's anything to snuff at. Could it be more? Definitely. But, I'm happy with what I've accomplished. So that will be included with the email sign up. If you manage to sign up before I have that published, ready and edited and everything, then I'll still send it to you. So feel free to sign up. No pressure. I'll send it to you after it's put together. So I'm going to call it The Casual Author, because it makes sense, right? So other than that, in terms of authoring, I did send Demon Blooded, which is the second book of the Hidden Heritage, off to the editor. I finished reading it, editing it, and I actually loved it. I'm very proud of it. The story is so fun. If you don't recall, the Hidden Heritage is a story of these teenagers who are half human and half something else. So David is half dragon, Krista is half demon, and Jared is half fairy. And it's about them, they need to find the other three. There's 6 in total of these half-blooded royal, they're like princes and princesses in this other land, and they have to go find them. So the second story is from Krista's perspective. The first one was from David's, and the difference being David was a little bit more of, I don't know what's going on in this universe. I know of my heritage. I know a little bit about it. I have certain abilities that make it awkward in the human realm, but I don't know much about this other world. Krista, on the other hand, has been training her whole life. Her parents have known that she's going to be going back to battle. She's very confident in herself. She's very strong and skilled, and it's fascinating to write a first-person book from someone who's confident in that perspective. And it was just fun. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I'm really looking forward to getting that back from the editor in about a month, probably a little more. It's kind of long at some point to learn how to write short books, but it was just a blast. I did finish Dwarf Blooded. I talked about that a little bit before. That one is even more interesting because it's from the perspective of the dwarf blooded person. I won't give any details, no spoilers here, but this person has absolutely no idea that they even have heritage. So they are an orphan, interestingly enough. So grew up in the foster system, and it's a complete shock to this person when, they're found. In any case, no spoilers, like I said. Find out a little bit more at the end of Demon Blooded, but just having a blast with the series. So I did start the 4th book, which is actually going to be called Fairy Blooded. So there's the title reveal for you if you're interested. And this is actually going to be Jared's perspective, who was in the first book. So very interesting, because if you haven't read the first book, Jared has the ability to read minds. So writing a first-person book from someone who can read everybody's minds, absolutely fascinating. So hopefully that comes across pretty well. So yeah, that's good. Having a blast writing that series. I'm really looking forward to getting a book out to you every 6 months. I think it feels good, and it brings more finishing energy to it, because I'm constantly getting a book finished, rather than, recently I published something. I did Dragon Blood before that. It had been a while. So I think the schedule makes sense. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to be talking a little bit about things that I've learned and podcasts that I've started listening to. So I do want to highlight a couple things here. I've started listening to the 6 Figure Author podcast. Now, this podcast was actually discontinued at the end of 2023, but they have 120 some odd episodes, and it's from these three authors who are six-figure authors, but they probably are still today. And they just talk about how they got there, the things that they did, what they changed, and I would love to be a full-time author. That is definitely a goal that I have, and that would require being a six-figure author someday. So if you're interested in the podcast, it starts a little bit older. I think 2019 is the first episodes. There's still a lot of gems of knowledge and information in there. In fact, the second episode that I just listened to is all about marketing your books. It's from someone who loves marketing. She has her own marketing business for authors. She also writes and is very successful. So lots of tidbits in there that I was just like consuming. I was so excited. I was like, oh, this is a great idea. I need to change this. I need to change this. And that's part of why I came to separating my email list for the podcast and my author business. So if you want to hear that, it's episode 2 of The Six Figure Author. Definitely recommend that. Additionally, I did read Turning Pro by Stephen Pressfield. So this is a book that I heard about from Joanna Penn, from the Creative Penn. She talks about how she is actually one of her older episodes. Long story there, but I'm going through some older ones to learn some progression from her. But she talks about how she reads Stephen Pressfield's Turning Pro every year. So I was like, cool, I'll grab it and read through it. Very quick read. I listened to an audio format of it, about 2 hours. It's very fast, but it is interesting. It is very, I don't know how to describe it. It's very mixed feelings from people about whether or not they like it. He has a very artful view on what it takes, or at least what it took for him to go from amateur, he says, from an addict, not necessarily like a drug addict or alcohol addict or anything, just like an addict and amateur, to turning pro. He remembers the shift in his life, his mindset shift, what changed for him, and from then on, how he pretty much made it to be a full-time pro author. And it's very beautiful. Like the prose is incredible. It is very insightful. It wasn't a book that just told you do this, do this, do this, do this. It was mainly, this is what you experience when you're in the amateur bucket, and this is what you experience when you're in the professional bucket. And you can kind of slate yourself in. So you're like, oh, well, where am I here today? And it is very interesting to kind of gauge yourself based on his descriptions of the two, and try to understand, well, what changes will I need to make, right? He doesn't outline them for me. He just talks about these are elements and habits of a pro, and these are elements and habits of an amateur. So I definitely recommend it. It was definitely worth the buy. It was a very quick read. I will probably read it again, just because it was so much information and so fast, but very beautiful. And I do recommend it. So once again, that's Turning Pro by Stephen Pressfield. I'll put that in the show notes. But let's see, I believe that's everything in terms of updates and podcasts and everything. So I do want to start this. One thing that I would love to hear from you is where you're listening, what you like about the podcast. So I've got social media, I've got TikTok and Instagram. Probably should start on Twitter. Haven't done that quite yet, but message me. Let me know where you're listening. Tell me via email. You can message me at dan@thecasualauthor.com. I'd love to hear from you. Or if you have any questions for me, if you want to learn more about me or my homestead or how I run things, definitely let me know. But I want to hear what you think about the podcast and where you're listening from. So don't hesitate to message me. Additionally, I have mentioned this before. I do have a Patreon. Currently, I've been terrible about actually putting out Q&As. Primarily, that's because I'm not getting a lot of questions. So ask me questions. If you have questions for me, I definitely want to go in more in depth about how I do things from a pantsing perspective, discovery writing, or just running my life. So send in those questions. I'm happy to answer them. But yeah, the Patreon is just a few dollars a month. That's just if you like what you hear, you want to hear more, definitely subscribe, but no pressure. I'm hoping in the future, once I get a little bit more time, to start adding value and information to that Patreon. But we'll see when that will happen. Life is a little bit chaotic always. But let's see. I believe that's everything. I already said that, but now that was truly everything. So we can go ahead and shift over to the interview rather with Elizabeth.
Hey Elizabeth, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you?
Doing very, very well. Excited to learn more about you and your writing and your process. Before we get into all that, how long have you been writing and publishing?
Oh, I have been writing pretty much my whole life. My very first writing award came in the first grade, so I feel like I can really say that.
Nice.
But I've been seriously writing now for almost 11 years. And by serious, I mean that is my occupation for the last almost 11 years.
Nice. So you went full time with authoring from the beginning then? It was a business from the beginning, or did it ever start as like a hobby?
It started first as a hobby, and then I decided I wanted to do more with it. I wanted to really explore publishing. I wanted to be able to write more books, and so that was kind of the agreement. I when I came to my husband and I said, "Can I just do this?" And he was like, "I don't know." And I was like, "But it's going to be published and it's going to be great someday. Can we take that risk?" So definitely started much smaller than it is now. It's a much more prominent part of my life.
Very cool. So you were working prior to this, and it was kind of a risk, a leap to say, all right, I'm going to stop whatever job I was working on at the time to dedicate full time to this.
Yeah,
Very cool.
definitely put a lot of pressure on my husband.
So I want to pick your brain on this because I think there's a lot of us out there that are in this space where there's the dream of I want to do this full time, but there's barriers, whether they be financially, time wise, or whatever barriers we make up for ourselves, right? What preparation did you have to go through before you felt okay taking a risk like that? Or was there any preparation?
I mean, I'm a bit of a pantser in books and life
Okay,
too,
fair enough.
as
I
we
like
talked
that.
about earlier. And so probably should have been more preparation, but it definitely was like that spur of the moment. November was coming up and I was gonna do nano,
Hmm.
and I was like, this is a great time to just drop it all and do books. And so I think if you're taking that risk, definitely do more research into your own life than I did. Definitely look at your finances and make sure that's going to be okay. Because I definitely jumped in with that perspective of it'll work out and everything will be fine. And I know that doesn't always work out, and I've gotten very lucky in that way that books actually did get published and things did move forward. But yeah, it was definitely just more of a I think I just want to do this more than a I've looked at it and this is the right choice.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Keep in mind that your advice isn't the end all or be all. I don't think people listening are gonna be like, I'm just not going to prepare. If that works for
Right,
you,
right.
great. I've heard various things about people saving up money and or downsizing or whatever, and I was just curious if any of that played into your decision. Cool. I think look, I'm a proponent of pantsing everything. That's just how I live my life. There's pros and cons, right, to that. But
Yeah.
so you've written a number of books now. Was your first book published 11 years ago then, or is that just when things started getting serious before you
That's
actually
just when
published
things
them?
started getting serious. My first book actually wasn't published until I think 2020 is the official date because it made for a lot of problems as far as launching a debut author to come out in 2020. And it wasn't even my first book at that point. It was book number, I think it was eight. Book number eight was my first book to be published. I just kept writing and hoping that something was going to work out. And I think you can tell, I mean, if you've ever, no one will ever, but if anyone could see my earlier work, you can see that a lot of growth happened through those books, and we're better off that it took a little bit of time.
Yeah, no, I think that's amazing. So the first books, those were not published, or are those still drafts somewhere just floating in the ether, or did you end up doing something with
They're
the
still floating out there.
Okay.
My most recent book that came out in the spring, Seeking Neopolis, is actually an older book of mine. I think that one's number four. But so you get kind of an interesting look, I guess, at my writing this way because it definitely jumps around through my different manuscripts that are just kind of waiting in the dusty folders of the computer, hoping that someday my publisher will say, I'm looking for this kind of book. And I'll be like, well, actually, look at all these books I already did. So that's kind of the hope and the goal. I've also explored possibilities of doing some self-publishing on some of those older ones. But for the most part, I'm glad that they sit where they sit.
Yeah, I think I personally I can't do that for myself. I'm always impressed when someone's like, I wrote X number of novels, 10, 15. Brandon Sanderson wrote a number of novels that he says he's never looked at. I just have this like innate, how do I say this? obsession with not wasting material. I'm just like, I
Yeah.
can't let something sit. If I wrote it, I will beat the crap out of it until it's ready to do something with it. I just admire people that are like, yeah, it's okay. I can let that sit maybe sometime later. I'm just impatient, I guess. I don't know.
Well, this is just the way I nurtured my self-esteem during the querying process.
Fair enough.
If you
Okay.
hate this book, that's okay. I have another book now.
All right. Yeah, I think that's fair. So yeah, you dove right into querying. It's something I've never dabbled with. I just knew from the beginning I'm not a great rejection handling person historically. Also, I decided I would rather write books than query letters. But for you,
So true.
how did you how did you go about that process? Like, how did you know who to query, what to do? Did you learn of that on your own, or were there resources you found for that?
I definitely started on my own. I think a lot of us authors, writers really are solitary creatures by nature. So you
Mm.
do a lot of that on your own at first. And then when things weren't working out and it had been a few years, I moved into going to some writing conferences. Um, Utah has a lot of big conferences. And so I started going to those and kind of trying to learn more. And through doing that, I found a writing community in my own community.
Cool.
And so by having those resources now and having more people, it became much easier to do some of that stuff. I still had to do the research of finding agents and publishers and who to submit to, but then I had this network of people that I was like, I wrote this query letter, what do you think? And have them very brutally say, that is the most boring query letter I've ever read. I would not read your first chapter either, you know? So it definitely gave me the perspective that I needed to change things up a little bit. In fact, one of my community members wrote a book on writing your query letter. And so I definitely used him a lot to be like, help me fix this. And
Yeah.
it was only after that point that I started getting any personal feedback back at all, where I started getting partial requests and full requests and things like that. I think if I had continued solitary, I would never have gotten to this point.
Hmm.
Because the query letter itself is such an art. It's its own thing you really have to master, and I just did not have the skills for that starting out.
Well, I think it's encouraging to hear that, right? Because I think there's a lot of people that go into it with whether or not, how do I say this? I don't mean people are incorrect to have hopes and dreams, right? But I think they go into it thinking it's going to be easier because they hear these grand stories of X person got a publisher, X person found an agent really quick, and great for those people. But when they start getting, amassing these rejections, then it's very disappointing. But it's nice to know that like you have to learn. It's an art you have to learn, just like writing anything.
Yeah.
You gotta figure out how to write a query letter. Um,
I got a lot of rejections on books that are published now that have different query letters now than they did then. So
mhm.
sometimes it's not even your book, it's just your letter, and that is so hard.
I just know that I wouldn't be able to handle it very well. But I think recognizing you can improve and just being patient is very important. So you have multiple publishers then? You and I actually share a publisher common. We have a common publisher between some of our
Yeah.
books, Stag Beetle Books. Are all of your books with Stag Beetle or some of them with other publishers?
So I kind of had an interesting journey. I signed a contract first with VA Vert. I was never good at saying the name, which is a publishing house that is now defunct.
Oh,
And so I was lucky to be able to get out of that contract without having to pay exorbitant fees and things. But then I moved into Cedar Fort, which is a local publisher here. And so I have two books out with Cedar Fort. Curse of the Forgotten and Out of Time are through them. And then they informed us in a very interesting way. We got a Facebook message before we got individually a message that Cedar Fort was no longer doing fiction,
hmm.
especially fantasy fiction. They're focusing on religious book, which was fine but scary then to be like, well, I had a publisher and now what do I do? And it was at that point that I really branched out again and I found Stag Beetle and I love Stag Beetle and I hope to stay there indefinitely.
Yeah, I've had a great experience with Stag Beetle books. I've only published my co-authored books with Laura, who is actually the owner of Stag Beetle Books. Coincidentally,
Yeah.
it's just kind of an experiment. But, I think it's an amazing publisher. So many amazing things are being done there, and the process I think is really smooth. That is my only experience though. It's interesting to hear you've had other experiences though to kind
Yeah.
of add to the mix. So for you, you mentioned some of these older books and you may bring them out. Do you anticipate
that's going to be something in the near future, or are you hoping to just get a certain number of books out before you revisit those ones?
That's a good question, honestly, especially because I mean, Laura of Stag Beetle has talked to me about a few of my books. I have one in particular, which is a Viking novel that she's like, if we could ever, give this one kind of a facelift, we could talk about this because I like the premise of the story. And it's so hard for me because I am that like I finish it and I hit the end and I try for a little bit and then I move into something else. And so for me mentally, I've really stepped away already. So that becomes a bit of a problem there to think about going back. But if I ever got, crazy Sanderson levels of success, I might send it out as just a funny, this is where I started. Everybody starts somewhere kind of thing. I don't foresee that happening, but if it ever did, then you might see some of these other stories,
No, I mean, I think
unless
that's
I have a
interesting.
lot of time to really dig through them.
Well, okay, coming from a pantser, that doesn't surprise me, honestly, because for this is me making some assumptions here. I could be incorrect, but from my pantsing brain, it's easier to move forward than to keep going backwards. And I think that's part of why I don't leave things behind, is because I think intrinsically I know if I leave this book behind, I'm probably never coming back to it. Just because I know myself, there's always a new story, there's always more books to write, and I'll just keep moving forward. So I think that makes
Yeah.
sense. It totally makes sense. So I'm curious to know what your writing process looks like because everybody's different. I know what mine is as a pantser slash discovery writer, for those of you who don't love that term. But for you, you mentioned you did editing and writing today before we started recording this call. Is that something you do every day, both editing and writing, or is that just this time period where you're
It's
doing
just
that?
this time period for right now. I have a book coming out next month that was originally supposed to come out this fall and then got tabled for next year's catalog and then got brought back in. And
Oh,
so that has made for things to be a little bit more complicated as far as making sure that everything is really tight and finished on a project that had been kind of sitting. Not that it isn't going to be good or professional, but it does make my timeline look a little bit different. Usually, how I write, I will do my initial story, and I'm a characters first writer. I always know my characters, and then I find my story as we're going usually, and I'll write my first draft usually within about 3 to 4 months.
mhm.
And then I will spend the next 3 to 4 months editing an older book. So I feel like I am getting fresh eyes on that book. And then I'll write another book. And then the next 3 or 4 months, I'll get back to that one I initially wrote. So I try to keep things fresh that way so that I don't miss a lot because I've had time to forget things. I don't always overlap, but with publishing, you don't always have a lot of control over your schedule that way. And so right now, there is an overlap, but I'm hoping that that won't last too much longer anyway, because I'm hoping to finish the draft I'm doing right now next week. So fingers
Oof.
crossed I can get that one out and just focus on editing.
It's coming right up. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so it's interesting to hear your perspective on that because for that same reason is why I went independent, or is it's a big proponent of why I didn't timelines, because my life is so volatile and unpredictable. I mean, I don't know if you know about my farm animals and my 7 kids and we're homeschooling and all the things we're doing. Like the last book, 2 books ago that I published ended up landing literally the week we moved states. It
Oh
was
my
when we were
gosh.
moving from Utah to Idaho. And I had already planned it for like months ahead of time. And it was ridiculous. The launch was awful. It's fine. Like it was my fault for, I didn't know it was going to happen. But that was exactly the reason I was just like, I can't adhere to someone else's deadlines. I just know I won't be able to because of all these crazy things that are going on. And so I was like, I'm just going to self-publish. That way I can set my own deadlines. And there's pros and cons to that. Sometimes I'm just not motivated. And so things come out slower than they probably should. But for you, has that been a constant stressor to have someone else setting deadlines, or are you cool with it? Like it works for you the way you're doing it.
I'm a huge deadline writer anyway, so I
Okay.
don't mind the deadlines as much. I mean, like I said, I finish my first drafts within 3 to 4 months because I'm a deadline writer. I'm a Monday through Friday. You're going to write this many words no matter what anyway. So because I'm so scheduled, I just kind of adjust the schedule around what the publisher needs and that makes it work. I think if I wasn't already writing very organized like that, that would be a huge problem because I would start to jumble together. I would have a hard time keeping track of everything that I needed to do. But in this like aspect of life, I have found that the structure is okay, and I've been able to work with that, which is really great because it allows me to stay on a publisher track instead of moving into self-publishing, because I know that I don't have the motivation enough to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important thing to recognize. If you know yourself and you know your history and what works for you, then I think that's most important. Oftentimes, a lot of people, I think, will overthink, maybe this is a bad thing to say, but overthink the decision around traditional and independent publishing. I think it's important to take into consideration your options and think it through, but I think sometimes it's just like, you know yourself, right? It's you just got to do what works for you, and I think it's amazing. Side note, I do want to point out that I also your writing process sounds similar to mine, where I set things aside and I literally forget what happened in that book. I mean, I'm such a heavy pantser that I'll come back and I'll read a book and I don't remember writing any of it. I'm just like, did I actually write this? I don't remember this. I also
Yeah.
don't take notes, which is a problem. So, I don't even remember where I got the thought, or it just comes out of my head. So,
Sometimes I'm smart and I have a cork board and I'll put notes down on the cork board. But even that I'm not super great at, to the point where I was doing a reading of one of my books. It was actually out of time. And I was reading the first chapter and I was like marveling. It felt so stupid. I was like, I'm marveling at my own writing. Look at what I did. I forgot I did this.
no, it's true. Sometimes I'm just like, I didn't know I knew that word. Like, it's just
Yeah.
like, I know what it means, of course, but my speaking is very different than my writing. So, I find that so fun though. So I'm curious from your perspective, what is, the highlight or your favorite part of discovery writing or your writing process?
My favorite parts of the writing really are that first draft. I love going through that first draft. I love, like I said, I'm a character first writer. So before I have an idea, I feel like I know my characters.
Mhm.
And so it's so fun to go through that first draft and to like feel everything with them as we're going through it. And because sometimes in that first draft I don't know what's gonna happen. I mean, it's discovery writing, so you don't know what's gonna happen. Sometimes I might have an idea, but ordinarily I know my character and I know my first chapter. Typically, I know a little bit of how it will end, and then we just go from there. And it's just fun to have that to experience everything, because it's like living your own book that way,
It is.
when you don't know exactly what's going to happen. I mean, I've had instances actually with Seeking Neopolis when I wrote that one where I had characters that had secrets that I didn't even realize they had until about partway through. And I was like, why are you so shifty? Oh my gosh, this is what's happening. So it's kind of that fun experience there. And it makes it fun in the first draft because you can edit later and make it
Right.
all be cohesive and flow. But it's fun that first time for me, just like it would be fun for my readers that first time too.
I agree. Actually, you're one of the first people. I think I've heard it from one other author. A lot of people are kind of scared of the first draft. I'm in the exact same boat as you, where for me, the best way I describe it to someone is it's like reading the book for the first time, and I kind of forget that I'm writing it. Like
Yeah.
it's just flowing, it's coming out. I'm just hanging on every word as it comes out. And they're like, I just can't understand that. How can you be reading a book while you're writing it? It's like, that's just how it works. I don't have much forethought when I'm in the writing process. I have also thought through endings that didn't end up happening, right? It was just like there was like a full shift at the end that I'm just like, okay, that ending didn't work. This one does. And I've been surprised, and I love that process. That's my favorite as well. But on the same, on the flip side, I am curious to know, as a discovery writer, what is the most difficult or your least favorite part of the writing process?
I think my least favorite is probably the edits when you go back and you're like, oh, now I had to connect some of these things a little bit
Mhm.
better. Like I said with Seeking Neopolis, there were secrets there. Well, now that I know the secret, I have to go back and I have to make that a little more cohesive, a little bit better. Or if there's the big reveals, maybe they didn't reveal quite as well, and now I have to fix that. Or there was one time even I wrote a book and my beta reader came back to me and said, I think you forgot the climax. They're like, I think I know what you were like planning, but you have to add that a little bit better for us. And I was like, well, I wasn't planning, and thank you. So that's the hardest part for me sometimes, is to go through with critical eye of here are the gaps. And I think that I only dislike it because I think that the first draft is so fun, that now the editing is the work. This is when it starts to actually feel like work. And then it's work forevermore after that point.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. But I mean, you mentioned something that I think is so important in that process. Also, side note, I hate editing. Full stop. I no matter how hard I try, I just can't figure out how to make my brain want to do it. I do it. I force myself to do it. But if I find myself in the throng of only editing for too long of a period of time, I get frustrated. I just
Yeah.
wonder if authoring is even anything I want to do because it's just hard for me. Regardless, you mentioned beta readers. You mentioned having people to provide that feedback. I know that that can be a challenge, particularly for introverted authors like myself. How did you go about identifying good beta readers to work with? I say good because sometimes beta readers aren't fit for an author, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. I think you have to find ones that jive with you. But how did you find your beta readers?
I definitely agree with you about the good because there are a lot of different beta readers out there and not all of them will be a good fit. I definitely went through a few before I found what was a good fit for me.
Right.
I know my own ego can't handle the beta readers who they love to find the negatives, which is great, but they don't highlight the positives to the point
Mm.
where I'm like, did you even like this? And they're like, yeah, of course I did. And I'm like, then where are those comments?
There's nothing good.
So I definitely need the beta readers that give me that little bit every now and then, like, oh, this was a great line, or I got one today, even as I was going through, that was like the alliteration here is perfect, things like that. And so what really helped for me was having my community. So I joined the League of Utah Writers,
Hmm.
which offers up a large amount of people now. And even just where I am in the valley that I am, there are two different writing groups here. And so you can kind of go through and you can ask people for help. I started with first page and then first chapter just to see different people's writing or different people's editing styles, how they're going to edit that, and also how quick can you be? Because I am a speed writer. I've gotten a lot of flack for that in my groups because I mean, many authors will spend years working on a book, and I'm like, well, I just finished two. So there's that difference too of you need to find the beta readers who fit within your time schedule, and so having that group, finding the community that's around you is really important. And online is a great tool too. I've posted on Twitter or X, I guess we're calling it now, and I've been like, I really need someone to go over this chapter. Can anyone do it? With like the hashtag writing community, and had someone there be like, well, I'm an English teacher. Do you want me to go through? And I internally cringe a little bit because I'm like, oh, the English teachers, but it works out that way too. So just I think even though we're introverted, we have to be a little bit brave and farm it out enough to know who works best for you. And then I've been able to have really great relationships with my beta readers to the point where I've stayed, especially I have one, especially Alan. He is my favorite and he has read everything I've ever written at this point. It always goes through Alan first. So if you keep trying and finding it, if you have problems with your editors, it's probably not editing that you hate. It's just you have to find different editors.
That's fair. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point to point out. I haven't found a dedicated set of beta readers. I've worked with a bunch and, some have landed. I think the timeline factor is also a challenge for me because I do tend to write a little bit more quickly. I don't edit quickly, but I can write pretty quickly. I've established a flow state. I don't know if you feel this as well, but when I have writing times during the day, I can usually get 1,500 to 3,000 words out in an hour, depending on how flowy it's going.
Yeah.
And you can say, I mean, that puts a book together pretty quick. Keep in mind, it's kind of scrappy, and I recognize there's going to have to be rounds of edits, but still, yeah, that's the tricky thing is having someone who can keep up with you. But it's
Yeah, now
encouraging.
my editor Alan knows every fall and every spring he
Good.
is ready for a book to come out.
That's excellent. That's very, very cool. And I've tried to establish a more regular schedule, something I've never done before. And I think that helps, that works for a lot of people, right? Because then they know what to expect, all editors, beta readers, advanced readers, and whatnot. So I think it's good to establish that. Have you always operated from a 2 books a year type process, or is that something you've done recently?
That's been more recent in my writing journey. I used to just do one. I have three boys, and I decided to start doing this as a career when my second was a newborn baby. So
Hmm.
that has made life complicated. It definitely wasn't like the perfect time to start by any means. And so I used to just do one, and I used Nano a lot for my initial like formatting of let's just get 50,000 words. And if I can do that, then I have accomplished something with all the kids going around and all the stuff there. And so that's really how I started. And then once I figured out kind of what worked for me as far as how many words a day I felt comfortable with, where I knew that my flow could take me on average, I moved away from Nano, especially because I feel like November is the worst month. Maybe not the worst, but it's a terrible month for that. There's so much going on. So
Hmm.
I have moved away from Nano. I start on my own timeline. And I started doing that initially, was still just one book. And then I thought, well, I bet I could do two. And now I typically do a book per semester that my kids are in, so I can have summers free to do editing, which can be a little bit more fluid and to spend more time with my kids that way. And some years that works really well, and other years I'm like, there is one really bad book. I did one book I like, and I did one book I hate this year. Like, and it works for me to go through that way because I like being able to move past the books that maybe didn't work out so well, that felt really hard to do. One year I did three books, and
Mm.
I don't recommend that. Where I just kept writing. It worked. There were three books at the end of the year, but it was so mentally draining that I've never gone back to that.
I think it's important to try different things. Like you said, you now know that you hadn't known that before, but now you tried three books. You know that one book wasn't quite enough, and you found this kind of like nice schedule niche that works for you, which I think it's amazing. I think there's a lot of authors that, it advice is helpful from other people, but it also take it with a grain of salt because sometimes that advice might not work for you. I think people are afraid to discard advice that might not fit their mold or where they're coming from. I do want to point out that I also stopped doing NaNoWriMo for similar reasons. Long before I know there's controversies going on, I don't really play into controversies as much as possible. I stopped doing
Yeah,
Nano from the beginning because with such a hyper focus on word count, it was detracting from the actual story itself. I find it's more effective for myself to have time in seat as opposed to word count per day. If I don't care how many words I get in a day, then, as long as I'm writing for, say, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, whatever I've scheduled for that day, then it just flows more clearly. And I didn't like how focused you have to get X number of words per day to hit your 50,000. It was distracting. I didn't like it. If I don't do Nano, I can get about 80,000 words in a month. If I do, then I find myself struggling to even hit the 50 because it's just so focused in a place I don't want to be. But
for me it was like Thanksgiving morning. I'm making turkey and I'm trying to put pies together, and I still have
typing
like
with one hand.
1,800 words to do. I was like, this does not work for me.
Yeah, it's I don't like it. But yeah, I mean times and seasons, you with children, without children, whoever you are, your circumstances, there's gonna be holidays, work, school, wherever you are. There's ebbs and flows to everything. And so recognizing that I think is helpful when it comes to writing.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
being okay with it. So what piece of advice do you have for people who, they're writing their first book and they want to start going into querying? What advice do you have for someone from the beginning?
Oh man. It don't take your first initial rejections personally,
Okay.
because your first rejections really are just learning the process. And in that vein too, don't send your first query to your favorite agent. Wait
Mm.
a little bit, get a little bit of feedback, and then send it out because your odds are probably a little bit better at that point. And definitely, as hard as it is, someone needs to look at your query, because you as writers, we inherently fill in the gaps of our stories, and so we write these blurbs for our books that may not completely make sense or may be boring because we have read the book already a million times now as we've edited, and so we
Mhm.
need that eye. That is so big, because I know that in your query, it's chunked, right? You have three different sections. You have the introducing and why I picked you, and then the part about your book, and then the part about you. And people worry about that part about you, right? Will they not care, or will they care too much that I don't have writing credentials yet, or I haven't done this or that yet? And I have found as I go through that process that that's not the big thing. I mean, my first queries just said that I participated in Nano. Like I went to college and I participate in Nano, and I was still able to get a contract after that. So don't let the fact that nothing has happened yet for you hold you back. And just work hard on that blurb, because that's the big thing. And that's the big thing, and also your word count.
Yeah.
It took me, I think, a year and a half to realize how important word count was. It wasn't until I started going to conferences and I went to some classes actually with Angie Hodap. She's with
Hmm.
the Nelson Literary Agency, and she talked about how if you need to know how many words are normal for books in your category. It's all different, right? Different genres, different age groups, it's going to be different. But you need to have an awareness of that and have your book fit within those parameters, because if they don't, agents are less likely to read them for that reason. I mean, so like for example, I wrote my first nano book. Now I have a book that's 50,000 words and I'm so excited and I'm sending it out and I'm not sure why I'm not getting anything back. Well, first of all, if you start sending out your queries in December, they're going to suspect that it's nano, especially if it's 50,000 words, right? They're going to be like, you didn't even edit. But second of all, it was that word count. It didn't matter how great my story was. The word count didn't fit within the industry standards of the time. So if you're having issues, look at your blurb, look at your word count. Those are the big things to remember as you get started. And then take the rest from there, I guess.
No, I think that's amazing advice. I have heard the word count thing. Once again, I've not really dabbled with traditional publishing, or I've been self-publishing most of the time, actually the entire time. But yeah, the word count thing I struggle with, for one, and two, I do recognize that that's a really big thing. Also, good piece of advice on not querying the agent you really want at the beginning. It's kind of funny. It seems like it's a very logical thing, but I didn't even think about that. The two query letters I sent were specifically to agents that I really liked, or I'd researched or had published books that I really enjoyed, and didn't even cross my mind that, hey, you might not be very good at querying yet. So take a chill pill, do some test queries to some other people, and then come back to those you really like later. So,
Because then you have to do the walk of shame. I'm retitling this book so you don't know that I've queried you
right.
about it before. Please love it now.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that's all. It's crazy. I mean, I was listening to a podcast. It was I don't know if you listened to The Creative Pen by Joanna Penn. It's an excellent podcast. She was talking to someone who predominantly traditionally publishes their books, and this person was talking about just the querying process. And she also doubles as an agent, or not an agent. I think she's an editor for a traditional publisher. And she just made the point that you have to keep in mind that agents and publishers, they're looking for business opportunities. Whether you like that or not, you have to keep that in mind when you're querying. They're taking a financial risk on your book. They need to know, can they reap that back slash get income from that? And so when you come at it with that perspective, it's a little bit less gutting, I think, when rejections come in, because it could be any reason. It could be they just do that, they don't do that genre, or they're not expert in that genre, or maybe there's elements of the story that they don't think can provide in the current time period an income for them. So once again,
Yeah.
whether or not you like it, it has to be a return on investment for these agents and the publishers. So,
Well, and sometimes the market's just too flooded with whatever your genre is, and
right,
they have to take a break that year. And that has nothing to do with your story. That's
right.
just the market.
Exactly. So something to keep in mind. That didn't make me feel any better, because I still don't want to write career letters. But for someone who is, dedicated to wanting to go through that route, hopefully that's some encouragement to keep going. So,
Yeah. I mean, I could tell you, like I'm about to have my sixth book come out. I have hundreds, maybe 1,000 rejection letters that came first. So you just never know how it's going to work out. And if that's the route that you've chosen, that you really want to do traditional publishing, I mean, my dad told me this all the time. He's like, if you keep persisting, something's going to work out.
right.
He's like, as long as you never give up, something will happen. And in those darker days, I was like, nothing is ever going to happen. That's stupid advice, but in the end, it's true. If you keep trying, something will happen. You'll find the right publisher. You'll write the right query letter. All of that stuff, as long as you keep working at it.
Indeed. Just keep swimming, as Dory
Exactly.
says from Finding Nemo, right? Well, very cool. We're running a little short on time. Where can people find more information about you and your books if they want to check them out?
So my books are right now available wherever books are sold, basically. They're on Amazon. They're also on Barnes and Noble, which will be good to know because I have a book coming out next month. It was my first real foray into romantasy. I'm very excited about, so that's where you'll be able to find that. And then
Very cool.
I have a website that I don't update as often as I should, but I'm also on Instagram and TikTok.
Excellent.
That's
We'll make
the
sure all
best
those
way to
links.
find out about what's going on.
I'll make sure the links are in the show notes so people can find those pretty easily. But thank you so much for your time. This is a very fun and enlightening conversation.
Yeah, thanks for chatting with me.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Elizabeth. She was just a positive person. I really enjoyed her insight and her talking about her experience with querying, even though I've never had that. It always, brings it to home. It helps validate for me my decision in self-publishing. Do I think that I'll query someday? Possibly. I mean, who knows? I'm young. I have a lot of books to write. Anything could happen. But for now, just taking in all the things she's learned about the changes, the shifts she's made in her strategy is very insightful, and it's encouraging to know that hey, if something's not working today, I could shift it, and more than likely, it'll get to a place where it's working for me. So just gotta stay on our toes. If that makes sense. Next week, we'll be talking to Leslie Shreve about her methodology called Taskology, and it is the method for what she says to have the most productive day possible. So we talk a little bit about linear thinking and how to manage your tasks. That's kind of unconventional. So it's perfect conversation for me because I'm not a super organized person, and it just brought to light a lot of changes I could make into my schedule and how I could run my podcast a little bit differently. So definitely tune in for that next week. Once again, it's going to come out on Monday, so keep an eye out for that. But thanks for listening today. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to talking to you again next week. Thanks.